Hello guys, in this lesson we want to create components for everything that you see here and make it like this. So follow me on this lesson if you like to know how. Okay, here is the roadmap for this lesson. First of all, we want to start by creating a component for input container here inside the login page. The input container div and its label will be put inside this component. So from the terminal menu, select new terminal, then go to the front end folder and write ngGC for generating the component inside components folder, partials folder with the name of input-container. Then press enter. Okay, it is generated successfully. Close the terminal and go to the Explorer and go inside the partials folder. Here we go. We have the input container here. Open it up and open the input container component TS file. Here we want to add two inputs. The first input, that is the label with the type of string and required, and the second input with the name of BG color that is equal to white by default. This is the label text and this is the background color for styling the input container. Super simple, we are done with here. Let's jump into the input container HTML file. Clear everything here. Let's add a div with a class of container and an ng style for setting the background color by BG color input. Then close the div. Put a label here and set its value to label input and put another div here with the class of content, and inside it put an Angular special tag that is ng-content. This is a placeholder so you can pass HTML tags directly to this component. I will tell you how in the next steps. One thing before using it inside the login page component, go to the input container component TS file and remove app dash from the beginning of its selector. So when we are using it, instead of app dash input container, we use input container. It makes it easy to read. Now go to the Explorer and open up the login page component HTML file, then write input-container and set the label to email and close the tag. We don't want to touch BG color for now because we want it to be white. Now anything that we put between the input containers tags will be placed on this ng content. So let's put the input and validation errors inside it. Let's add the input tag here and the error list. Then remove the input container. I will apply the same thing for the passport after finishing all the components here. Now if we go to the browser, we need to see exactly the same thing. As you can see, we have the email here, so it works. Now we want to give a style to the input container component and make it beautiful. So let's go to the code and from the Explorer, open up the input container component CSS file. For its container class, I want to set a position of relative. Its margin bottom should be 0.5 rem, border radius 0.7 rem, padding top 0.3 rem, and it should have a border with 1 pixel thickness, solid, and with the color of E0, E0, E0. The next thing is the label that we want to give a style to it. Set its display to inline block, its margin left to 0.5 rem, its font size should be 0.9 rem, and its color hashtag 5F5F5F. And the font size should be 1 rem. And the last class that we want to add style to it is the content. Its padding should be 0 from top and bottom and 0.5 rem from left and right. Its height should be 2.7 rem. Its display should be flex, and align items should be centered vertically. Here we go. Now if we look at the browser, we could see that we have a beautiful round shape border for the input container and a good amount of space between the text input and the label. As the second step of this lesson, I want to make a component for the input validations. So let's get back to the code and close everything about the input container. Now from the view menu, open up the terminal, clear everything and write nggc, generate the component inside components folder, partials folder with the name of input-validation. Press enter. Okay, it is generated. Close the terminal, open up the Explorer, and find the input validation folder and select input validation TS file. At the top of the component, we want to create a constant for validators and their messages with the type of any that is equal to an object. Here I want to define for which validator which error text should be shown. For the required, I want it to be should not be empty. And for the email, it should be email is not valid. Just like how we did inside the login page. But instead of writing them separately, I want to give the form control to the input validation and it will do the rest. So get back to the input validation component and scroll down inside the input validation components class at the first input. That is the control. It should be required with the type of abstract control. It is coming from Angular Forms. An abstract control is the type of control that we used here inside the validation. So we can pass them as input to the input validation component. For the next input, I want to have a Boolean with the name of show errors when, with the type of Boolean that is true by default. In fact, you can use ngF, but if you use so many of them inside one form, it is hard to read. But in fact, they do exactly the same thing. They just check if, for example, the is submitted is true, it shows the error list. And the last field that is not an input is error messages. That is of type string array and its default value is an empty array. We need to fill these error messages based on the error keys inside the control. Now we need to define a method with the name of check validation that returns a void to fill these error messages. Let me tell you how. Create a constant with the name of errors that is equal to this.control.errors. In fact, we are putting the errors of the control, for example, email, inside this constant. Now we need to check if the errors are empty or null. Then we need to set the error messages equal to an empty array and we need to return out of this method. Otherwise, we need to get the error keys using object.keys function by passing the errors to it. So this will be an array with the required or email like this. So we can easily map these keys using this content into these messages. So at the end, we need to have an array of errors like this, not required or email. We need to have something that the user understands. So let's write this dot error messages is equal to error keys dot map key and write validators messages the value of key. If the key is required, this will return should not be empty, and if it is email, this will return email is not valid, and that's what we want. So at the end, we are going to have a list of error messages to show to the user. Now that we have this check validation method, we need to call it in all change situations for the control and the whole component. Let's start by component change. Here on the implements part, after the on init, put a comma and write on changes. As you can see, we have an error on the class. It says that we didn't implement on changes interface. So press Ctrl dot and select implement interface on changes. As you can see, we have a new method with the name of ng-on-changes. Remove the throw line because we don't want to throw any error messages. We just want to do this check validation. Then we need to go inside the ng-on-init, and for control value change and status change, we need to call the check validation. So write with me this.control.validation status change. That means when its validation status changed, subscribe to it and call this.check validation. And for this.control.value change, the subscribe, and the value change means when we enter something inside the input. Once again, we need to call this.check validation. Here we go. We are calling the check validation in all change situations. Everything about the input validation component is ready, except the selector. Remove app dash from the beginning of the selector of this component. Now click on here and go to the input validation component file. Clear everything. Go to the login page component and copy this error list from here and paste it here. Instead of fc.email.errors, we are using error messages. And instead of is submitted, we are using a general form. It is show errors when. Now instead of showing each validation error one by one, we can create a loop here. So remove these and add a div with ng4 to create a loop. Write let error message of error messages. And inside it, just show the error message. Now, based on how many error messages we have, for example, email is not correct, we're going to see that error message here. Now, before adding a style to it, let's go to the login page and use it. Here, instead of this error list, we can add an input validation with the control of fc.email and show errors when with the value of is submitted. Close the input validation. So remove the error list from here and let's go to the browser and see if we could have the same behavior. Press login. As you can see, we have the validation message here with the new format. Now let's go to its CSS file and make it beautiful. From the Explorer, inside the input validation, select input validation CSS file. It has only one selector with the name of error-list. Its color should be red. Its text align should be center, and its font size should be 0.95 rem, a little bit smaller. Let's check it out the browser and click on login. As you can see, its color changed and its size is a little bit smaller. Now I want to combine the input container input and input validation into one component with the name of text input. By doing this, instead of using input container, input, and input validation, we just need to use only text input that has everything together. So from the view, select terminal and clear everything and write nggc for generating the component inside components folder, partials with the name of text-input. Then press enter. Close the terminal and close everything related to the input validation. Open up the Explorer and find text input and select text input component TS file. Here, since we want to use the input container and input validation and input all together, we need to add all of their inputs here too. For the first input, let's add the control with the type of abstract control. Second input should be show errors when, that is Boolean, and it is true by default. We use this control both for the input and the input validation. The third input is label that will be used for input container. And the last input is type that is specific for the input. Its type could be either text or password or email. And it should be text by default. This is one of the coolest features of TypeScript, that you can define strings as your type. So if you enter anything other than items that you defined here, it will throw an error. It will help you to keep your code free of syntax errors. Now let's open up the text input container component file and clear everything here. Now copy all the input container from here and put it inside the text input. Here, instead of the label, let's use label like this and pass the label input inside it. Set its type to type input and set the placeholder to this label. Here, instead of form control name, we need to use form control. But if we pass the control to it, it will not accept it because it needs a form control. So we just need to cast the abstract control into a control inside a getter property. So go to the text input and after the type, press enter and write get form control and return this.control as form control. It should be part of Angular forms. Okay, now we can go to the text input and instead of control input, we can use form control property. For the control of input validation, we can directly use control input, and for its show errors when, we can use show errors when input. So here we have our input container, our input and input validation together on a single component. Now let's go to the text input component and rename the selector to text input and use it inside the login page. Here we can write text input. We need to set its control to fc.email. Show errors when is submitted. The type should be email. And the label should be email with capital E. Then we can close the components tag. Let's remove this input container from the top and let's go to the browser and click on login. We have exactly the same behavior for the text input component and the default HTML. Now we can go and give a style to the text input container. From the Explorer, open up the text input component CSS file. Let's start with the input, set its width to 100% and its height to 100% too. Its border should be none, no border, but we want a border bottom with the thickness of 0, solid, and gray color. We need it because we want to add a transition here and show an animation for the bottom of the input. So we set the transition. We want a transition animation for the border bottom, so copy it and paste it as the first parameter of it. The duration of the animation should be 0.15 seconds or 150 milliseconds, and its curve should be ease out. It's just personal preference. You can set it in anything you want. Set its background color to white, and its font size should be 1.1 rem, a little bit bigger than normal. And lastly, set its outline to none. Okay, let's check out the result. Here we go, there is no border, but the placeholder is not very beautiful. Let's change its style a little bit. So write input -- placeholder. By this selector, you can change the placeholder of the input. Set its color to #df, and its font size should be 0.95 rem. Okay, let's check out the result. As you can see, it is more beautiful. Now we want to show the animation when we focus over the input. So let's do it inside the code. Scroll down and select input : focus and set its border width to 2.9 pixels. You can say, I don't see any animations here. That's right, there is no animation, but we set the animation by using the transition. So anywhere, if we change the border bottom of the input, for example here, we are changing it inside the focus, it will show it as an animation. Let's check it out. Now if you click inside the input, we will see a beautiful animation at the bottom of it. Now I want to work on the showing the input validation, okay? Select input -- validation. By doing this, we are directly selecting our custom-made component. Yes, that's possible. You can select your custom-made component inside the CSS with its tag. And we are doing it right now. For the input validation, we want its display to be flex. Its justify content should be center horizontally and align items center vertically. Its position should be absolute. From the top, it should be 0. From the right, 1 rem. And the height should be 100%. And the width should be 12 rem for the input validation. Let's check it out. Click on login to see the validation messages. As you can see, it is exactly on the middle, beautifully. Now let's do the same thing for the password. Get back to the code and close everything about text input. Then inside the login page component HTML file, duplicate the text input component and paste it at the bottom of it. For the control, use fc.password. Show errors when is submitted to. Its type should be password and its label should be password with capital P. Now we can remove everything about the password old format. As you can see, we have two text inputs, one for the email and the other one for the password. Let's check it out inside the browser. Here we go. It is much more beautiful than before. Now we can use this text input component in all the pages that we want to send something to the server. And anytime that we want to change it everywhere, we just need to change the text input component. That's a great feature. Now after email and password inputs, we want to work on this button. We want to make a component with the name of default button for it. So let's go to the code. So from the view menu, select terminal and write ngGC for generating the component inside components folder, partials folder with the name of default button. Press enter. Here we go. The default button component is generated. Let's check it out inside the Explorer. Inside the partials menu, as you can see, we have the default button here. Now open up the TS file inside it. Here we have a couple of inputs to add. The first one is the type. So input, the name of type, that should be submit or button. That is submit by default. Second input is the text. That is of type string and it's submit by default. The next inputs will be used for styling. Let's start with BG color with the default value of hashtag E72929. Next input is color, that is white by default. Next one is font size rem, that get the font size in rem unit, that is 1.3 by default. And the last one is width rem, that is 12 by default. We have something here that we didn't have before, and it is output, because this is a button and we need to give it an on-click event. And for passing the events, we need to use output. Its name should be on-click and its default value is new event emitter. But it shouldn't come from the stream. It should come from the Angular core. Make sure that you selected the Angular core. Press enter and put the parentheses at the end of it. If you go to the imports part, we can see that the event emitter is part of Angular core. By using this, we can pass our click event to this default button component. Very nice. We are done with the TypeScript file. So click here and select the HTML file. Clear everything here. Then add a div with the class of container. Inside it, obviously, we need to have a button. We have a couple of things to set for ng style. First one is the color, should be color input. Its background dash color should be bg color. Font dash size dot rem should be font size rem. And width dot rem should be width rem. Close the button. JavaScript doesn't support to put dash between the name of the objects. So for doing that, you need to put it inside quotations. And for passing the unit inside the ng style, we need to do it with the dot. For example, if you want to pass pixel, we need to say .px. But here we want it to be rem. Okay, the type of the unit should be the type input. And its click event should be on click output dot emit. If you look at here, you can see this is an event emitter. So we need to call its emit method to call the event that we've got. And lastly, let's set the text of the button. Once again, we want to go to the component TS file and remove app dash from its selector. Now let's go to the login page component HTML file, and at the bottom, let's use default dash button with the text of login and remove this button div. Since we want it to be a submit button by default, we don't need to pass anything to its on click here. so it works as a submit button. Let's check it out inside the browser. Here we go. Let's click on it. As you can see, we have the default functionality of the button. Now let's go to the CSS file and make it beautiful. From the Explorer, select default button component CSS file. For its container, we want to have a display of flex. Its justified content should be center. Its width should be 100%. For the button, its height should be 3.5 rem. Border should be none. And outline should be none too. Its font weight should be 100. And its border radius 0.8 rem. Its width should be 100%, margin 1 rem from top and bottom, and auto from left and right. And the opacity should be 0.8. And for the hover effect, button, hover, we want to set the cursor to pointer and opacity to 1. Let's check out the browser. Okay, we have this beautiful button. Let's put the zoom back in to the 100%. This is how our page should look like. And if we click on it, it works as expected. Okay, this was for this session. You've been watching Code with Nasir, and I hope to see you next time.